The Appalachian Trail, a 2,200-mile stretch winding through the eastern United States, was a place where dreams and nature intertwined. It was a journey of a lifetime for many, a haven of tranquility and challenge. But for Melanie Cross, it became the gateway to a nightmare that would haunt her forever. Melanie, a 24-year-old outdoor enthusiast, had always dreamed of hiking the trail solo. "A chance to find myself," she told her family as she packed her gear. A petite woman with auburn hair and a fiery determination, Melanie had been preparing for months, researching campsites, stocking survival gear, and brushing up on wildlife safety. Her adventure began in Georgia on a bright spring morning. The air was crisp, the forest alive with birdsong, and Melanie felt at peace. The trail was her sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of the world. But as she ventured deeper into the wilderness, a chilling silence began to creep into her idyllic surroundings. It started subtly. A hiker she met warned her of strange occurrences, missing hikers, eerie sounds at night, whispers among the trees. "Stay alert," the man said, his voice low and urgent. Melanie brushed it off as campfire tales meant to spook the inexperienced. But by her third night, she began to notice things she couldn't explain. Camping alone near a secluded bend of the trail, Melanie awoke to find her campsite disturbed. Her tent zipper was partially open, her belongings scattered. At first she thought it was an animal, but the footprints left in the dirt around her tent were human. Barefoot, too large to be hers. Panic set in. She hastily packed her things and decided to hike through the night to the next shelter, a cabin-style rest stop often frequented by hikers. The trail was eerily quiet, her headlamp casting long, sinister shadows on the trees. The feeling of being watched gnawed at her sanity. When she reached the shelter, she found it empty but eerily pristine, as though someone had cleaned it meticulously. Exhausted, she decided to stay, barricading the door with a wooden plank she found nearby. As she drifted into a restless sleep, a noise jolted her awake, a faint tapping on the window. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Melanie's heart raced as she peered through the glass. A figure stood just beyond the light, unmoving, a grotesque shadow against the moonlit trees. Its face was obscured, but the faint outline of long, tangled hair and a distorted grin sent waves of terror through her. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond but instead disappeared into the darkness. Melanie spent the rest of the night clutching her camping knife, her ears straining for the faintest sound. The next morning, Melanie found herself questioning her sanity. Had it been a trick of the light? She convinced herself to press on, eager to reach a more populated section of the trail. But as she hiked, she came across an abandoned campsite. Tent shredded, gear scattered, and a chilling sight, a trail of blood leading into the woods. She reported the scene at the next ranger station, but was met with a mix of disbelief and concern. "We've had reports of disturbances," the ranger admitted, "but nothing concrete. Stay on the main trail and avoid camping alone." Melanie's unease grew. Her solo journey had turned into a desperate race to stay ahead of whatever or whoever was out there. As she continued, she started noticing signs, makeshift totems made of sticks and bones hanging from trees, carvings in the bark that resembled symbols she didn't recognize. One night, while camped near a rocky outcrop, Melanie was startled awake by the sound of footsteps circling her tent. They were deliberate, heavy, and far too close. She held her breath, her knife gripped tightly in her hand. The footsteps stopped, and then came a low, guttural whisper, "Leave." Terrified, Melanie decided to abandon the trail and head to the nearest town. But as she hiked down the mountain, she realized she was being followed. Every turn of the trail brought the same distant sound of cracking branches and shuffling leaves. Her attempts to lose her pursuer only led her deeper into the wilderness. As night fell, Melanie stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. With no other options, she took refuge inside, blocking the door with a rotting table. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls were covered in strange markings. It felt like she had walked into the lair of something inhuman. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the cabin door, followed by a guttural growl. Melanie screamed as the door splintered under the weight of whatever was outside. She scrambled to the far corner of the cabin, clutching her knife as the door burst open. A figure loomed in the doorway, its features obscured by the darkness. But its eyes, two glowing orbs of malevolence, burned into her soul. Melanie braced for the end, but the creature simply stood there, staring, before retreating into the night. As the first rays of dawn illuminated the crumbling walls of the cabin, Melanie took a moment to steady her nerves. The horrifying events of the night were etched into her mind: the glowing eyes, the growls, the splintered door. The symbols carved into the walls seemed to pulse with an energy that made her skin crawl. Gathering her belongings, she decided to leave the cabin behind. But as she ventured deeper into the trail, she stumbled upon something that stopped her dead in her tracks: a cemetery. The gravestones were weathered, the names nearly erased by time. At the center was a large cracked monument bearing an inscription, "In memory of the forgotten souls, 1871." Melanie felt a chill as she read the words. Who were these souls, and why had they been forgotten? As she scanned the area, she noticed the same strange symbols etched into the stones. It dawned on her that this place wasn't just a resting ground but a marker, a warning to stay away. But it was too late to turn back. Melanie continued her hike, her pace quickening as unease settled over her like a shroud. She was miles from civilization, her phone useless in the dense forest. As she rounded a bend, she saw a figure sitting by the trail, a man disheveled and gaunt, wearing a tattered hiking jacket. "Hey, are you okay?" she called out, keeping her distance. The man looked up, his eyes hollow and sunken. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. Melanie approached cautiously. "I know. I'm trying to leave the trail. Do you know the quickest way to get to a town?" He didn't answer immediately, instead gazing at her with a mix of pity and dread. Finally, he said, "There's no getting out once it has chosen you." "What do you mean?" Melanie asked, her heart pounding. "The thing out here, it's not human. It's been here for generations, feeding off those who wander too far. It marks its territory with those symbols. If you've seen them, it means you're already its prey." Melanie's stomach churned. "You've seen it too?" The man nodded. "Years ago, but I escaped, barely. You'll need more than luck to survive." Before she could ask more, the man stood and disappeared into the woods, leaving her alone once again. Melanie pressed on, her thoughts racing. The man's words replayed in her mind. It marks its territory. It's not human. She began to notice the symbols more frequently now, carved into tree trunks, rocks, even the dirt path. Each one felt like a signpost leading her closer to something unspeakable. That night she camped in a small clearing, her fire crackling weakly against the encroaching darkness. The forest around her was unnaturally still. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just silence. She was startled awake by a scream. It was distant but unmistakably human. Melanie grabbed her flashlight and knife, her instincts screaming at her to stay put. But something compelled her to investigate. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness as she followed the sound. It led her to a ravine, where she found a mangled tent and the remains of what could only be described as a blood-soaked campsite. A journal lay among the debris, its pages torn and stained. Flipping through it, Melanie discovered it belonged to a man named Jacob, a hiker who had gone missing 2 years ago. His entries chronicled similar experiences: strange symbols, eerie sounds, and the feeling of being watched. The last entry sent a shiver down her spine. "It's here. I can see its eyes. God help me." As Melanie stood frozen, the forest erupted with movement. Branches snapped, and guttural growls echoed around her. She turned, her flashlight catching a glimpse of something enormous and inhuman darting between the trees. The glowing eyes appeared again, locking onto her. She ran, her adrenaline drowning out the terror coursing through her veins. The creature pursued her relentlessly, its growls growing louder and more menacing. She tripped over a root and fell hard, her knife skidding out of reach. The creature loomed over her, its features finally visible in the dim light. It was a grotesque amalgamation of human and animal, its body contorted and its face a horrifying mask of rage and hunger. In that moment, Melanie remembered the stranger's words. It marks its prey. Desperate, she grabbed a rock and slashed at her arm, smearing her blood over one of the symbols on the ground. To her astonishment, the creature recoiled, its growls turning into agonized howls. It retreated into the shadows, leaving her trembling and alone. Melanie didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the forest, where she collapsed in exhaustion. A passing hiker found her the next morning and helped her to a ranger station. She recounted her ordeal, but the rangers dismissed it as hallucinations caused by dehydration and exhaustion. Determined to prove the truth, Melanie returned with a search party, but the campsite she found, the journal, and the symbols had all vanished, as if the forest itself had erased them. The only evidence of her ordeal was the scar on her arm and the nightmares that would follow her for the rest of her life. Melanie survived the Appalachian Trail massacre, but she could never escape its shadow. Her story became a cautionary tale for hikers, a whispered legend of the creature that stalks the trail. And though many dismissed it as a myth, those who ventured too deep into the wilderness knew better. They'd seen the symbols, they'd felt the eyes watching them, and they knew the forest had a darkness that could never be tamed. Months after her escape, Melanie received a letter in the mail. It bore no return address and was written in shaky handwriting. You think you're safe, but it never lets go. If you want to end it, come back. You know where to find me. The letter sent chills down her spine. The only person who could have sent it was the stranger she had encountered, the man who warned her about the creature. Against her better judgment, she knew she had to return. Not for answers, but for closure. She couldn't live the rest of her life wondering when the entity might come for her again. Equipped with better gear, including night vision goggles and a GPS tracker, Melanie set out for the Appalachian Trail one last time. She carried Jacob's journal, now her talisman and guide, and left a note with a friend explaining her intentions should she not return. The journey was eerily familiar. The forest, so hauntingly beautiful in the daylight, turned sinister as the sun dipped below the horizon. Every shadow felt alive, every sound magnified. Melanie followed the trail markers until she reached the spot where she had last seen the stranger. This time, he was waiting for her. The man was even more gaunt than before, his eyes sunken and his clothes barely holding together. He gestured for her to sit by his makeshift fire, speaking in hushed tones. "It's been watching you," he said. "Ever since you left. You think you escaped, but it's been biding its time." Melanie showed him the journal. "What is it? Why does it do this?" The stranger sighed, his gaze distant. "It's older than the trail itself. Some say it's a spirit of vengeance. Others believe it's a creature born from the sins of the settlers who desecrated these lands. All I know is it feeds on fear and despair, and once it marks you, it doesn't stop." "Then why are you still alive?" Melanie asked. "I've learned to coexist with it. I follow its rules, stay out of its way. But you provoked it. It won't stop until it has you." The stranger led Melanie deeper into the forest, far off the beaten path. The symbols began appearing again, etched into trees and stones, glowing faintly under the moonlight. Melanie's unease grew with each step, the air growing colder, the forest unnaturally quiet. They reached a clearing where the trees formed a near-perfect circle. In the center was an ancient stone altar, overgrown with moss but pulsating with a dark energy. "This is where it anchors itself," the stranger explained. "If you want to end it, this is the place." Melanie's heart raced as the air grew thick with an oppressive force. The stranger handed her a crude knife. "Your blood brought it once. It'll bring it again. But this time you have to finish it." She didn't have time to ask how. The creature emerged from the shadows, its massive form more horrifying than she remembered. Its glowing eyes burned with rage, and its guttural growls shook the ground beneath her feet. Melanie cut her palm, letting her blood drip onto the altar. The creature lunged, but the stranger stepped forward, holding up a small bundle of herbs and chanting in a language Melanie didn't recognize. The creature hesitated, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if something unseen was holding it back. "Keep going," the stranger yelled. "It's weakening." Melanie pressed her bloody hand against the altar, the symbols glowing brighter and the air vibrating with an otherworldly hum. The creature howled, its form flickering as if struggling to maintain its shape. But just as victory seemed within reach, the creature turned its wrath on the stranger. With a single swipe of its claw, it tore through him, his body crumpling to the ground. Melanie screamed, but she couldn't stop. She pressed harder, reciting the words from the journal's final page. "By blood, by will, I sever thee." The creature shrieked, its form imploding into a vortex of shadow and light. The symbols flared brilliantly before fading entirely. The forest fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. Melanie collapsed beside the stranger's body, tears streaming down her face. She whispered a thank you to the man who had sacrificed himself to save her. Gathering his belongings, she made her way back to the trailhead as dawn broke over the horizon. Weeks later, Melanie recounted her story to the authorities, but they dismissed it as a delusion brought on by trauma. Yet she knew the truth. The Appalachian Trail was no ordinary place, and while she had severed the creature's hold on her, the trail remained a cursed and dangerous expanse. Melanie never returned to the Appalachian Trail, but she became a voice of warning for those who dared to hike its treacherous paths. She told her story to anyone who would listen, hoping to deter others from falling victim to the darkness she had faced. But in the deepest corners of her mind, she always wondered, had she truly destroyed it, or was it simply lying in wait for its next victim? Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more scary stories, please like and subscribe to my channel.